March 31st, 1993. Brandon Lee had 8 days of filming left on The Crow, the movie that would finally prove to Hollywood he was more than his father's shadow. 8 days until he could show the world what he was really capable of. Then a prop gun fired and he was gone. But here's what nobody talks about. Hollywood had already killed Brandon Lee's career years before that bullet ever left the chamber. What happened in those missing years? The answer will make you question everything you thought you knew about his tragic death. Chapter 1. The Weight of a Legend. Picture this. February 1st, 1965. A baby boy is born in Oakland, California, and before he even takes his first breath, his entire future is already written. His father is Bruce Lee, the man who single-handedly changed how the world saw martial arts, Asian men, and action cinema forever. The moment Brandon Lee opened his eyes, he was carrying a weight no child should ever bear, the weight of being Bruce Lee's son. Brandon's childhood was split between two worlds. The first world ended on July 20th, 1973, when he was 8 years old. His father, Bruce Lee, died suddenly in Hong Kong at 32, and overnight, everything changed. The martial arts icon who'd been teaching his son to move like water, to fight like lightning, was gone. Left behind was Linda Lee, Brandon's mother, trying to raise 2 children while the entire world worshipped a ghost. Growing up, Brandon trained relentlessly, not because anyone forced him, but because it was in his blood. He studied Jeet Kune Do under his father's students, learned Wing Chun, and threw himself into martial arts with the same obsessive intensity that had defined Bruce. But here's the brutal truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. No matter how good Brandon got, he'd never be good enough. Not in the eyes of fans who'd turned his father into mythology. By his early 20s, Brandon had the skills, the look, and the name. He stood 6 feet tall with striking features, his father's intensity burning behind his eyes, but with something else too. A darkness, a depth that suggested he understood pain in ways Bruce never had to. He could act, he could fight. He had legitimate charisma that went beyond simple nepotism. But Hollywood looked at him and saw one thing only: Bruce Lee's son, not a person, not even an actor, just a brand they could exploit or a risk they didn't want to take. When Brandon decided to pursue acting seriously in the mid-80s, the whispers started immediately. Industry insiders said he was trading on his father's name, that he hadn't earned his place, that every opportunity he got was because of who his father was, not because of his own talent. The irony was suffocating. If he succeeded, it was only because of nepotism. If he failed, he destroyed his father's legacy. There was no way to win. Chapter 2. Breaking in and breaking down. Let's rewind to 1986. Brandon's first real role came in a television movie called Kung Fu, the movie, playing the son of David Carradine's character. You want to talk about cosmic irony? David Carradine, the white actor who'd been given the role Bruce Lee created and was supposed to star in back in 1972, was now playing mentor to Bruce Lee's actual son. Brandon took the role because he needed the work, but anyone paying attention could see the humiliation baked into that casting. His film debut came in 1986 with Legacy of Rage, a Hong Kong action film where he played a man framed for murder by his best friend. Shot entirely in Cantonese, a language Brandon barely spoke. He had to be dubbed over in post-production. The film did decent business in Asia, where his father's name still carried weight. But in America, nobody even knew it existed. Hollywood wasn't watching. They'd already decided what Brandon Lee was worth. Then came 1988 and Laser Mission, a film so cheap and poorly made it barely qualified as a movie. Brandon played a soldier of fortune trying to stop the KGB from kidnapping a scientist. The budget was non-existent. The script was worse. But Brandon showed up, did his stunts, and tried to make something watchable out of nothing. This was direct-to-video hell, the same wasteland where talented fighters like Don Wilson and Lauren Avedon were spending their entire careers. Brandon Lee, son of the most iconic martial artist in history, was making movies people rented by accident at Blockbuster. Here's where the pattern becomes clear. 1989 brought Laser Mission's release and another forgettable film. 1990 brought nothing. Casting directors would take meetings with him, see the potential, then pass. They'd say he was too Asian for mainstream roles, but not Asian enough for stereotypical martial arts parts. His last name opened doors, but the moment he walked through them, those same doors slammed shut. He was caught in the same trap that destroyed Lauren Avedon and limited Don Wilson. Hollywood's imagination was too narrow to process someone who didn't fit their predetermined boxes. But Brandon wasn't just fighting typecasting. He was fighting something darker. Whispers were spreading through Hollywood that he was difficult to work with, that he had an attitude problem, that he questioned directors and caused problems on set. These rumors didn't come from nowhere, but the truth was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Brandon had inherited his father's intensity and his refusal to accept mediocrity. When scripts were terrible, he said so. When fight choreography was lazy, he pushed for better. When directors treated him like a prop instead of an actor, he demanded respect. In Hollywood's eyes, that made him difficult. The same behavior that got white actors labeled as passionate or dedicated got Brandon Lee labeled as arrogant and hard to manage. And once that reputation attached itself to your name, it was nearly impossible to shake. Directors started passing on him, not because they'd worked with him and had bad experiences, but because they'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone else that he might be a problem. Chapter 3. The incident that destroyed his reputation. This is where everything fell apart. This is the moment that nearly ended Brandon Lee's career before it ever really started. And the craziest part, most people have never even heard about it. During the production of one of his early films, the specifics of which remain deliberately vague in industry circles, Brandon got into a confrontation with a stunt coordinator. Not a physical fight, despite what some rumors claimed later, but a heated professional disagreement about safety. The stunt coordinator wanted to shoot a sequence a certain way. Brandon, who'd been training in martial arts since childhood and understood body mechanics better than most stunt coordinators ever would, argued that the setup was dangerous and could result in injury. The stunt coordinator, feeling disrespected by a young actor who was only getting work because of his last name, pushed back hard. According to people who were there, the argument escalated. Voices were raised. Brandon refused to do the stunt as designed. The stunt coordinator went to the producers and complained that Brandon was being unprofessional and refusing to work. The producers, looking at their shooting schedule and budget, sided with the stunt coordinator. Brandon walked off set that day, not as a diva move, but because he genuinely believed someone was going to get hurt. He was proven right. 3 days later, when a stuntman performing the sequence exactly as designed ended up with a serious injury. But by then, the damage to Brandon's reputation was already done. The stunt coordinator had spent those 3 days telling anyone who would listen that Bruce Lee's son thought he knew better than everyone else, that he was difficult, that he'd stopped production because of his ego. The story spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community of stunt performers and action film crews. Within weeks, it had reached producers and casting directors. Within months, it was accepted as fact. Brandon Lee was difficult to work with. Brandon Lee caused problems on set. Brandon Lee thought his last name gave him the right to question everyone. None of this was explicitly said to his face. Nobody put it in writing. There was no official blacklist, no memo circulated. But the effect was the same. The phone stopped ringing. Auditions dried up. Projects that had seemed interested suddenly went silent. Brandon's agent would submit him for roles and get vague responses about going in a different direction or looking for someone with a different energy. The code was clear to anyone who'd been in Hollywood long enough. This actor has been marked as trouble, and nobody wants to take the risk. What made it worse was that Brandon couldn't even defend himself without looking like he was proving their point. If he stayed quiet, the rumors stood unchallenged. If he spoke up, he was being defensive and difficult, exactly what they were already saying about him. The system had trapped him perfectly. He could fight the rumors and confirm them, or accept them in silence and let his career die. For someone like Brandon Lee, who'd spent his entire life trying to step out of his father's shadow and prove his own worth, this was devastating. He'd trained for years. He'd worked on his craft. He'd taken roles in terrible movies just to gain experience and prove he was serious. And now, because he'd stood up for safety on a film set, Hollywood had decided he wasn't worth the trouble. This is the part of Brandon's story that gets erased from the tragic hero narrative, the part where the industry quietly suffocated his career while he was still alive, the part where gatekeepers who'd never thrown a real punch in their lives decided that Bruce Lee's son, a man with legitimate martial arts mastery and genuine acting talent, was too much of a risk to hire. Chapter 4: The Invisible Blacklist. By 1990, Brandon Lee was basically unemployable in mainstream Hollywood. Not officially, of course. There were no documents, no smoking gun proving a conspiracy, just a pattern that anyone paying attention could see. Actors with half his talent were getting roles he should have been considered for. White actors who'd taken a few karate classes were being cast as action heroes, while a man who'd been training since childhood couldn't get arrested. The direct-to-video market became his prison. 1991 brought Showdown in Little Tokyo, where he played second fiddle to Dolph Lundgren. Brandon was magnetic on screen. His fight scenes were technically superior to almost anything else in the genre, but it didn't matter. In Hollywood's hierarchy, direct-to-video meant you'd failed, regardless of how good you actually were. Let's compare Brandon's trajectory to his contemporaries. Jean-Claude Van Damme was already a household name with a $12 million budget for Double Impact. Steven Seagal had gone from Aikido instructor to leading man in 3 years, making out for justice with Warner Brothers backing. What did these men have that Brandon didn't? Not better martial arts credentials, not better acting ability. Watch early Van Damme films and count how many lines he flubs. Watch Seagal try to show emotion in anything. The difference was simple. Van Damme and Seagal were white. They fit Hollywood's narrow imagination of what an action hero should look like. And most importantly, when they demanded things on set, they were called professionals protecting their brand, not troublemakers questioning authority. The Asian factor cannot be ignored. In the early 90s, Hollywood was still deeply uncomfortable with Asian leading men. Jackie Chan was succeeding, but only by playing comedy and making himself non-threatening. Brandon was too tall, too handsome, too intense to fit the submissive Asian stereotype. But Hollywood hadn't figured out how to market an Asian action star who demanded to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor. Brandon understood all of this. He knew talking about it publicly would only make things worse, confirming the difficult reputation that was already destroying his opportunities. Chapter 5: Clawing Back from the Void. But Brandon Lee didn't quit. That's the part of his story that makes everything that came later even more tragic. He could have walked away, could have taken the easy path of living off his father's legacy, doing conventions and endorsements. Instead, he doubled down. 1992 brought Rapid Fire, and this was Brandon's statement. This was him proving to everyone who'd written him off that they'd made a mistake. Filmed for $6 million, substantial for the genre, it gave Brandon his first real leading role in an American theatrical release. He played Jake Lowe, a college student who witnesses a murder and gets caught between the mob and dirty cops. The film's production was where Brandon started rebuilding his reputation. Director Dwight Little later said Brandon was one of the most prepared actors he'd ever worked with. He showed up early, knew everyone's names, collaborated with the stunt team, and executed fight choreography that was technically superior to what Van Damme and Seagal were doing in their films. When Rapid Fire hit theaters in August 1992, it proved something crucial. Brandon Lee could carry a film. Critics noted his charisma, his fight skills, and most importantly, his dramatic range. He wasn't just doing martial arts, he was acting, bringing real emotion and vulnerability to a character who could have been one-dimensional. More importantly, Rapid Fire changed the conversation around Brandon in Hollywood. The difficult reputation started to fade. His agent was getting calls again. Real calls from people making real movies with actual budgets. Then came The Crow, based on James O'Barr's cult comic about a murdered man who returns from the dead to avenge his fiance's death. The property was dark, gothic, and unlike anything in mainstream action cinema, Brandon saw what everyone else had missed. This wasn't just another action movie, this was a chance to prove he could do serious, dramatic work. The character of Eric Draven was wounded, poetic, consumed by grief and rage. He fought for the role relentlessly. When he got it, he threw himself into preparation with the same intensity his father had brought to his work. The Crow began filming in February 1993. Everyone on set could feel something special was happening. This wasn't just going to rehabilitate Brandon's career. This was going to make him a star. Chapter 6: The Crow and the Comeback. That almost was. By March 1993, production on The Crow was in its final weeks. Brandon had been shooting for over a month, and the transformation was complete. He'd inhabited Eric Draven so thoroughly that crew members said he seemed to carry the character's melancholy even between takes. The makeup took hours to apply, white face paint and black accents that made him look like a beautiful corpse. The costume was all black leather and flowing fabric that moved like shadows. But there was something else happening too, something darker than the character Brandon was playing. The production was troubled in ways that went beyond typical filming difficulties. The budget had been slashed mid-production, forcing the crew to cut corners they shouldn't have cut. The shooting schedule had been compressed, meaning they were working longer hours with less preparation time. Safety protocols that should have been standard were being skipped to save time and money. Brandon noticed. He mentioned concerns to producers about how fast they were moving, about whether proper precautions were being taken. But he was the actor, the talent, and production decisions weren't his to make. He'd already fought that battle on earlier films and been labeled difficult for it. This was his comeback, his chance to prove he belonged in Hollywood, and he couldn't afford to make waves. So he voiced his concerns and then trusted that professionals were handling things properly. The role was transforming how people in Hollywood saw him. Producer Jeff Most was already talking about a sequel. Directors who'd previously passed on Brandon were suddenly interested in working with him. Scripts were being sent to his agent for films with actual budgets and real distribution deals. Everything Brandon had worked for, everything he'd survived in those years when Hollywood tried to bury him, was finally paying off. His fiancée, Eliza Hutton, visited the set regularly. They were planning their wedding, scheduled for April 17, 1993 in Mexico. Brandon talked about the future constantly, about the career he was finally building on his own terms, about the respect he was earning, not because of his father's name, but because of his own work, about starting a family and maybe, eventually, stepping away from action films to focus on dramatic roles that would let him age gracefully as an actor. But the Crow's production problems were getting worse. The budget cuts meant they were using cheaper equipment and less experienced crew in key positions. The prop master was overworked and understaffed. Safety meetings that should have happened daily were being skipped. Everyone was exhausted from the compressed schedule, working 12 and 14-hour days trying to capture footage that should have taken twice as long to shoot properly. March 31st arrived. The production was 8 days from completion. 8 days until Brandon would wrap the film that would define his career and prove to everyone who doubted him that he was more than Bruce Lee's son, more than a direct-to-video action star, more than a difficult actor who didn't know his place. He was a legitimate talent who deserved everything he was about to achieve. Chapter 7, March 31st, 1993. The scene being filmed that night was supposed to be simple. Brandon's character, Eric Draven, enters his apartment where Michael Massey's character, Funboy, is waiting with a gun. Funboy fires. Eric, already dead and essentially invulnerable, doesn't react. He walks toward Funboy and delivers a line about the futility of shooting a ghost. Simple, routine. The kind of scene they had filmed dozens of times already. The gun that was supposed to fire a blank had been used in a previous scene where it needed to look loaded with real bullets for a close-up. Someone on the prop team had created dummy cartridges by removing the gunpowder from real bullets, but leaving the primers intact. The dummy rounds were loaded for the close-up shot, then supposedly removed, but one wasn't. The primer, when struck, generated enough force to lodge the bullet in the barrel. Nobody checked. Nobody realized the gun was now effectively loaded with a real bullet, even though the blank cartridges being used later should have been safe. When the blank was fired during the scene with Brandon, the explosive force behind it was enough to propel that lodged bullet out of the barrel at lethal velocity. Brandon was standing approximately 15 feet away when Michael Massey fired the gun. The bullet struck Brandon in the abdomen, just above his right hip. He fell backward and called out to the crew that he thought he'd been shot for real. The crew initially thought he was acting, staying in character. Precious seconds were lost before anyone realized this wasn't part of the scene. By the time paramedics arrived and rushed him to New Hanover Regional Medical Center, Brandon had lost massive amounts of blood. Surgeons operated for 5 hours trying to save his life, but the damage was too severe. At 1:04 p.m. on April 1st, 1993, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old, the exact same age his father had been when he died 20 years earlier. The cosmic cruelty of that coincidence, father and son both dying at 28, would fuel decades of speculation about a family curse. But curses aren't real. What happened to Brandon wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was the result of budget cuts, corner cutting, overwork, and the same industry negligence that injures and kills crew members on film sets every year. The difference was that this time, it was the star. And Chapter 8. What Hollywood didn't want you to know. Here's what nobody talks about when they tell Brandon Lee's story. Here's the part that makes his death about more than just a tragic accident. The Crow's production had been plagued with safety issues from the beginning. A crew member had been seriously injured earlier in the shoot when a scaffolding collapsed. A stuntman had been badly burned in a special effects mishap. A lighting technician had been shocked and nearly killed when equipment malfunctioned. These weren't random accidents. They were the predictable result of a production that was cutting corners to save money while maintaining an aggressive shooting schedule. Industry safety professionals who reviewed the production's protocols after Brandon's death identified multiple violations of standard safety practices. The prop department was understaffed. Equipment wasn't being properly checked. The safety coordinators were being overruled by producers worried about budget and schedule. When Brandon had voiced concerns about the pace of production and whether proper precautions were being taken, he was politely told that professionals were handling it. His reputation for being difficult on early film sets hung over those conversations like a ghost. He couldn't push too hard without risking being labeled a problem again, not when this film was supposed to be his comeback, his vindication, his proof that he belonged. So, he trusted the system, and the system killed him. The investigation that followed was careful to avoid assigning blame in ways that might expose the production company to lawsuits. Michael Massey, who pulled the trigger, was devastated and traumatized. He'd done nothing wrong, had followed every instruction given to him, and had to live for the rest of his life knowing he'd killed someone. The prop master was quietly let go, but never faced criminal charges. The producers expressed deep regret, but maintained that proper safety protocols had been followed, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. What Hollywood learned from Brandon's death wasn't that they needed to change their practices. What they learned was that they needed better insurance and more legal protection. Productions continued to cut corners, safety continued to be secondary to budget and schedule, and actors continued to die or be seriously injured when those corners got cut too close. The Crow was released in May 1994, over a year after Brandon's death. The studio faced an impossible decision about whether to even release the film or shelve it as a cursed production. They chose to release it both as a tribute to Brandon and because the footage they had was too good to waste. The film became a massive cult success, earning over $94 million worldwide against its estimated $15 million budget. Critics praised Brandon's performance, noting the tragic irony that his best work was also his last. Audiences embraced The Crow in a way they'd never embraced Brandon's earlier films. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of him were mourning what could have been. The performance was everything Brandon had hoped it would be. Dark and intense and emotionally raw, proving he could carry a film as both an action star and a serious dramatic actor. And he never got to see it. Chapter 9. The Legacy. They tried to bury. Today, Brandon Lee is remembered primarily for how he died, rather than how he lived. The curse narrative dominates his story. The supernatural coincidence of father and son, both dying at 28 in tragic circumstances. But that narrative does Brandon a disservice. It turns him into a footnote in his father's legend, rather than recognizing him as his own person, with his own struggles and achievements. The real Brandon Lee's story is about a man who spent his entire life trying to step out of an impossible shadow, while fighting an industry determined to keep him in his place. He was too Asian for white America, but not Asian enough for those who wanted him to be Bruce Lee reborn. He was talented enough to deserve better opportunities, but labeled difficult when he demanded the respect his talent warranted. He survived Hollywood's invisible blacklist through sheer determination and talent, only to be killed by the same industry negligence he'd been warning about for years. If Brandon had lived, his trajectory was clear. The Crow would have made him a star on his own terms. He would have had his choice of roles, finally free to prove his range as a dramatic actor, while still doing action when he wanted. He likely would have been a pioneer for Asian American leading men in mainstream Hollywood, arriving at that breakthrough a full decade before actors like Daniel Day Kim and John Cho started getting substantial roles. Instead, we're left with what ifs and a filmography that doesn't do justice to his talent. Rapid Fire shows glimpses of what he could do. The Crow proves it definitively. But there should have been 20 more films, 30 more years, a career arc that let him age and evolve as an artist. There should have been a wedding in Mexico, and a family, and a life beyond the shadow of tragedy. What happened to Brandon Lee wasn't a curse. It was Hollywood doing what Hollywood does best, was chewing up talented people and spitting them out when they become inconvenient. He was inconvenient when he questioned safety. He was inconvenient when he refused to be typecast. He was inconvenient when he demanded to be seen as more than just his father's son. And when he finally broke through, despite all of that, the system killed him through negligence and corner cutting that prioritized profit over human life. That's the real story. Not a mystical curse, but a systematic failure. Not tragedy, but injustice. Brandon Lee deserved better than he got from Hollywood, both before and after his death. He deserved a career that matched his talent. He deserved to be safe on the set where he died. He deserved to see his comeback completed and celebrated. He deserved to grow old. Every time Hollywood refuses to learn from its safety failures, every time a production cuts corners to save money, every time talented actors get labeled difficult for standing up for themselves, Brandon Lee dies again. His real legacy isn't The Crow, as beautiful as that film is. His real legacy is what he represents. Everything Hollywood destroys in its pursuit of profit and its resistance to change. There's only one Brandon Lee, and Hollywood never deserved him.